Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, Episode 183. There's a 20% chance we're all Sims. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, we'll continue with Soul Change. Here, I look at what changes our soul on an individual basis and what might change us as a group. Then, it's on to there's a 20% chance we're all Sims. Here, I look at who we are and why we exist. This show will feature background footage from Rumbling Bald on the trail from Rumbling Bald to Shumont. This is a different section of Rumbling Bald than that I filmed before. There are two sections of Rumbling Bald in Chimney Rock State Park. Well, perhaps even more. Rumbling Bald, well, rumbles on for quite a ways. Anyway, the part I'm referring to is the part beyond the state park. To get to Rumbling Bald, you go to Chimney Rock, North Carolina. You head east out of town. Just before the Broad River, you take a left on Boys Camp Road. Then you stay on Boys Camp Road. You'll come up a hill. On the left, you'll see a sign for Rumbling Bald at Chimney Rock State Park. This is the main entrance. This is where I filmed several times before, with the giant boulders and the cliff. Kind of a surreal landscape. But here on this show, I go to somewhere else. Instead of pulling off at that parking lot, you stay on Boys Camp Road, and you keep going. Eventually the road splits. You stay to the left, still on Boys Camp Road. Right at the end of it, or just before the end of it, you take a left, and you go on that road until you see Blue Heron Point subdivision. You pull over there, keep walking forward up a paved driveway which leads to a water tower. After that, it becomes a dirt road, which turns into a trail. Anyway, the trail splits. Shortly thereafter, I stayed to the left, almost a U-turn, a very sharp left. However, I believed that trail took me above the cliffs of Rumbling Bald, and eventually I came to a nice rock formation. And so what it is, I came out on this rock monolith that was on a side trail to the left off the main trail. Anyway, and off of this rock monolith were beautiful views of Lake Lure, which I'll include on this show. Now, as I went up, as I approached the monolith, shortly before I got to it, there was a truck along the side of the trail. I guess they tried to go four-bying. The trail was very rocky and rough. To me, impossible to go four-bying. the truck was in the woods. Well, I guess they tried. Anyway, perhaps, I guess, stuck there forever. Okay, shortly past the truck, there's a main trail to the left, which goes to the rock monolith overlooking Lake Lure. However, if you go straight, in theory, eventually you'll come out to Shumont Road, which is off of Highway 9, and that's the other end of the trail. So the trail goes from near the end of Boys Camp Road till the end of Shumont Road, about a 6-mile distance. That is, if I'm describing the right trail. I said I split off to the left. Maybe I should have stayed straight. Well, maybe I'll stay straight next time and hike that trail and figure out where it goes to. I'm always curious for a new hike. So, now, let's continue with soul change. But these social networkings could affect our soul, could affect our personality, could affect who we are, as well as commercials, perhaps even cell phone applications, and, of course, schools, even sports and hobbies and other activities. Church, of course, as a preacher or priest or rabbi, whoever we're listening to, tells us about important religious information that might affect our soul. And these all operate in a group sense, in the sense that typically several people are affected at once, perhaps many hundreds at once. Perhaps not in the same way, but often in a similar way. And there are many, many other ways of group soul change. This is a huge subject. And I guess you could say group personality change. But as our personality changes, so too might our soul. If these changes to our personality affect changes to our value system. Because if they do, then they'll change our soul. Remember, our soul is closely connected and affected by our value system. So when our values change, our souls change. And our value system is often affected by our personality. So as our personality changes, so do our values change. And our personality can be changed by all the means I just listed. From books to TVs, social networking sites, church, and so on. So, we are affected in many ways as a group. But what about as an individual? Well, we are affected too. Well, we affect our own change as an individual, and perhaps we'll change one other person in the sense of one-on-one interaction. So perhaps something that we experience, perhaps as a couple of people. Well, these interactions, these one-to-one interactions, one-on-one interactions, can change both participants, or at least one of them. In either case, I would consider it, in a sense, a soul change. I guess interactions amongst 3 or more people might be considered a group soul change. Anyway, but we could even get closer, more to a true individual soul change. Sure, as we look at our own experience, well, our own experience affects us, even though a lot of it might be shared. The sum of it is individual, and a lot of our experiences are individual. Perhaps that's the key, is taking time to make individual experience. Taking time away from distractions and interruptions by turning off the TV, turning off the music, and just listening to the silence or the background noise that's normally there, be it the wind or the sounds of the city or whatever it is. Listen to it, the sound of the rain, or the sounds of the city, or the sounds of the animals, or whatever's out there. And by listening to it as an individual and experiencing it as an individual, without the distractions of other things like music and TV, or activities, or, heaven forbid, multitasking. Fooey on that. Often when you multitask, you might not do all the tasks well. Even though it might take longer to do all the tasks individually, often you might have better results. You have to just weigh the extra time spent with the better results gained. And perhaps a better sanity gained from doing things with less multitasking. Anyway, perhaps multitasking might wear on your sanity. You tell me. Anyway, because I don't multitask much, I guess. I just instinctively avoid it, I guess. Well, anyway, so we need our experience by ourselves to get soul change, to have soul change, truly just us changing our soul, instead of other people changing our soul, being affected by a similar event or situation. So we need to get by ourselves, to have change just by ourselves. So, we need to get away from interruptions too. Often, when we're thinking about something important or making important plans, that's when obnoxious interruptions can occur. We need to think about that and see if we can reduce it to allow more time to think about important things and make important plans and analyze our lives alone, by ourselves, with enough time. Anyway, we could go into meditation. We could pray. And, of course, there's intuition and insight, which affect our soul on an individual level. And, of course, I guess there's our research. Things we might find out on our own, through experience, or through simple analysis and thinking. Thinking, which might be done best alone, away from distractions. However, if you are lucky, you might have some good friends who like to talk about deep philosophical subjects and will help you, guide you on your way towards some good ways of soul change. That is, making changes to your personality and your value system, particularly your value system, but making these changes as an individual instead of through some group activity. And of course, remember, even if we watch TV alone, the TV program we are watching is watched by many people. Same with playing video games alone, etc. No, sometimes to get true, real soul change and make it truly an individual thing, well, we just have to do it by ourselves with meditation and prayer, intuition, insight, creativity, and so on. Things we could do all by ourselves. And there's probably a lot I left out that we could do by ourselves to affect changes in our value system. Well, why do I emphasize changing your value system by yourself? Well, sometimes it's good to do it that way, to break away from the influence of the group. Sometimes the group is led down the wrong path, and ultimately the wrong changes come about. I guess the Tea Party might be a good example of that, of people being led down the wrong path. But I guess that could be another show. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this section of the Casey Waters Show. Now, it's time for There's a 20% Chance We're All Sims. And of course, I mean simulations. Anyway, first, let me take a little diversion for a bit. There's this corrupt judge who was being bribed by a youth detention facility. They would send him money, probably per conviction, that resulted in a youth staying at the facility. Perhaps a judge got paid per night per youth. Who knows? Anyway, he got sentenced to 28 years in prison for corruption charges and for sending the youth to the detention center inappropriately. Or at least some of them were sent there inappropriately. Well, anyway, there were like 4,000 youths that were sent there. Many of them didn't need to go. One of them killed themselves shortly after returning home, if I'm not mistaken. And that was one of the plaintiffs in the case. Her son spiraled out of control on a downward spin because some corrupt judge convicted him, sent him to a youth detention center when that was too strict a punishment, when something less harsh would have been more appropriate. All these people going to detention, all these youths going to detention, people going to prison too. Why do we have so much people in prison? I feel it's inappropriate. I think there are better ways to fight crime. We don't have to lock up all the criminals. We could change them, influence them instead. Sure, it's a lot easier than you think. First of all, poor people need hope and opportunity. And we need to have a federal government that has lots of programs for poor people and encourages their development. Sure, we need to protect poor people, not cut their funding. Same with the mentally ill. You betcha, along with the elderly and other disadvantaged classes. We need to protect them, raise them up, give them hope, give them opportunity. And this will set the stage for a positive change. that will have economic benefits that will result in more money for the government in the long run. Of course, the same goes with the bloated military budget. We don't need to spend all this money on the military. No. We could take the auto increase, the money that the Pentagon's supposed to get extra each year, and we could put that towards social programs for the poor people and for building up the infrastructure in our country. If we were to cut 20% off of the current military budget and hold that level of cut and not increase the military budget for now on, we could save untold trillions of dollars, which could be diverted to all sorts of wonderful causes. Think about it. We don't always have to be number one, and perhaps we can be with a cheaper, more efficient military, instead of a military that gets more and more money every year, no matter what, while the poor continue to suffer. It just doesn't seem fair. Anyway, let's jump back on track here. There's a 20% chance we're all sims. That is, simulations. I know it seems shocking. I know it seems upsetting. However, I feel that the chance might even be more than that. This is according to Nick Bostrom, an Oxford University philosopher. Well, Nick Bostrom says there's a 20 to 50% chance we're all sims. And perhaps it's even more likely than that. Well, especially if you look at it from a different perspective. I could take that 20%, I could take that 50% and throw it to 100%. How? Well, you look at things in a different way. Okay, maybe we're not sims. I mean, maybe we're not artificial, right? I guess that what sims are, they're artificial. They're not true organic life forms that live and breed. Well, perhaps we are sims, but maybe not. And perhaps likely not. But how can I throw that likely not into a certainty? By assuming we're all an experiment of God's anyway. So, we could be natural, but we're still an experiment. We were still created for a purpose, and that was for God to test some ideas out and perhaps to gain some new experiences. Sure. So, we're an experiment. Well, some of these new experiments, these experiences that God might gain, might be the experience of being an individual and what it's like to see life from that perspective instead of seeing life from the omniscient, omnipotent perspective of God. Perhaps God likes to see things differently every once in a while. So perhaps God could dive into one of our heads for a little bit and hang out and see life from the perspective of an individual. And so perhaps as part of the experiment, and perhaps to test theories about morality. Morality is very complicated indeed. And As the saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So there's more than one way to obtain a moral goal. And perhaps some ways are better than others, but perhaps they're about the same. Well, I guess that's up to God to figure out and evaluate the subtle details of it all. But sometimes these subtle details could snowball into important changes. Anyway, so, according to Edgar Cayce, we are all God, and we decided to descend to this earth and become an individual. Well, if that's the case, it's sort of an experiment anyway. We're taking on a different form than we normally would have. In other words, we normally would be God, but we decided to descend to the earth and become an individual. Perhaps God broke up in this way, and we all are little fragments of God. However, we can unify and become God at any moment. At least that's my assumption. Sure. And when all the individuals, all the sentient beings of the universe unite and become one and become aware and become God, well, that sounds pretty omniscient and omnipotent to me. You betcha. Omnibenevolent too. And eternal. And so on. And having a deity, that is, containing its own reason for existence. So, God has many properties. So, God created us to test morality, individuality. Well, perhaps God created us to gain love, to gain our love that we feel for each other. Perhaps some of that goes up to God and benefits God. Just as God's love comes down from heaven and rains upon us all as God's grace. Sure, so there's this two-way relationship with our love benefiting God that we feel for each other, and God's love benefiting us in the form of grace. Also, in a sense, we can be all in one moment. We could be all in one moment of present time. Everything could be in one moment. In a sense, that's the way things really are. If time is an illusion, that is. So if time is not real, then everything is now. And everything is in the present time. All possibilities, all aspects. So we be young and old at the same time, and have all the possibilities and potentialities of both. We would have all the possibilities of youth and all the possibilities of old age. Everything, all eternity, would all be in one present moment. Everything would be accessible all at once.
KC Waters Show. Producer, KC Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, kcwaters2@kcwaters.com.